Andrew tells me we are live, so I got to get started. I better make this look official. That was always my fieldwork supervisor when I was in St. Louis at seminary. He would uh, he would always jump up on the counter in the back before worship. So he'd just kind of sit there with his alb on, and we'd wait for the bell to ring, right? Because that would be the time to start worship. And the bell would ring, and he'd swing his feet, and he'd jump off, and be like, "Well, better go make it look official." And then he'd walk right out, and we'd just start worship that way. So that was always his kind of the call to worship behind the scenes. So that's always. Oh, always. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, I love that. I love his phrasing in that. It's just so, yeah. Better go make it look official. Yep. It's good. So we are going to continue in Exodus. We're in Exodus 21. We wrapped up Exodus 20 with the Ten Commandments. We wrapped up each one of those commandments in its own way. Good conversation around all of that. Um, yeah, really good conversation. So that was really fun to walk through that. And now we're starting to get into the different, best way to describe it is the what does this mean of the Ten Commandments, right? And so now we're going to start getting into some more specific and practical applications that God is speaking to. We talked a little bit about that last week with the laws about altars, right? And it just seems to be, well, here's a random rule about altars, but it actually has like first commandment implications, right? So when we talk about you shall have no other gods, what does this mean? Well, you shouldn't have altars that fit this description that God provides here. And it talks about, where they're chiseled out of rock or whatever it might be, where they're kind of, what do you want to say that? Uh, Created, right? Because then it takes away from the creator. You should just use natural things because it speaks to the creator who created it, right? And so we talked a little bit about that last week and just some of the rules that come from that. And we're going to continue in that. It basically goes through Exodus 23 um, with a lot of just different what does this mean laws with the people and the Ten Commandments in particular. So, any questions about that before we dive in? All right, well, let's dive into the first fun one there, the laws about slaves. That always gets them going. Now, these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the seventh he shall go free, for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free. Then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost. And his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. Let's stop there for a second. Who doesn't love talking about slavery, right? Especially when it seems like Scripture is kind of being okay with slavery here. So let's talk through that a little bit. But first, let's start with now these are the rules aspect here. So again, as we talk through Exodus 23, lots of different topics: slavery, murder, liability for animals, theft, rape, idolatry, treatment of disadvantaged people, money and lending, justice with the law, basically just a lot of different things. But I think what's so telling about all these topics and why we have to talk about slavery, right? So why is this a thing? Why are there rules about it when it's not such a good thing? It's because these are the things that Israel was facing during its time in the wilderness, right? So you talk about all those different things: money and lending, justice with the law, treatment of disadvantaged people, liability for animals, theft, rape, murder, slavery. All of those things were real world things that the people of Israel were experiencing in the wilderness, right? And so when we look, just as the example, about slaves in particular, it's not like God is saying, hey, I'm good with slavery. Let's keep that going. Like that's a good thing. Basically here it's you guys have slaves, we know you have them, so let's put some godly parameters around that so that you can treat them well and so that there's a good thing that comes from such a broken thing. Okay? So don't take this slavery section as God saying, well, make sure you own slaves. That's a good thing, and we should all have that. Rather, he's saying, listen, this is a broken world. So let's put some parameters around it, because without the parameters on how you treat slaves, you're just going to keep taking advantage of them. And even as you look at like the first just couple of verses there, you would think that it would favor the master in terms of what goes on there, but really what it favors is the slave. Like there's a way out for the Hebrew slave. Whereas in most people's understanding of slavery, you never got out, right? And so it just, those kind of parameters are important to keep in mind as we look further into Exodus 21. So any questions about that before we dive in a little bit more into the slavery aspect? Yeah, so the question is, and I got to repeat the questions because there's no microphones here that pick you up, so bear with me as I repeat. So the question is, why slavery in the context? Why use that word? You could technically use the word servant, but it's pretty clear here that it's not just a servant concept, it's slavery. And yeah, the implication is no hope, but that's where God tries to speak his hope into it, right? So very much a part of life at this point in a broken world. So how does God speak into that brokenness, if you will? Nate. Yep. Yep. They are interchangeable. Yeah, the different translations Nate is saying use servant or slave. They are interchangeable. The Greek would use the word doulos, I think is the term, which is both servant and slave. But the concept behind it is more of a slave piece than a servant piece. So when we talk about like purchasing Hebrew people, right, we put that more in a slave category than a servant category. A servant category, for our modern terminology, would be more like of a job, right? You think of somebody who's like a maid or a nanny or something like that, where they're doing some housework, they're taking care of some things for you, but they're doing that out of their own freedom, per se, versus slavery, which is more, and we'll talk more about how do you become a slave, which is more based out of a bad situation than it is like a choice, if that makes sense. Like I said, we'll talk more about that, but that's why, like the ESV, the English Standard Version, uses slave here just because of the context and the way it's described, versus, say, again, like a maid or a nanny or something along those lines, where we see more of a servant role in that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, technically, you could talk about the South post Civil War indentured servitude, right? Which sounds like a much better way of talking about it than slavery, right? But actually, what they found is indentured servitude was just as bad. It makes it sound a little bit better, but it's just as bad because there was the promise of working to a point of freedom, but it was impossible. The person would never be able to do that. In fact, they would actually end up in worse shape than they were if they just remained a slave, because they would be so in debt to the master that you'd never get out. You'd never get out. Which again speaks to, why does God speak to this? Because we as human beings have a great way of really treating other human beings poorly, right? We're not going to take care of our fellow brother, especially when we see them in a lower position, which would be a slave or even a servant, to be honest with you. Yeah. Good questions. Any other questions? All right. So when we talk about buying Hebrew slaves, verse 2 of chapter 21, as we talked about already, it can also be translated as servant. Um, but very much the way God describes how they are to treat them is not how we understand slavery throughout history. Slavery in history is very negative, it's very harsh, it's very hard. And that's not to say that slavery, the way that God describes it here, is not hard or harsh. But God is trying to speak into it in a way that you see there after 7 years, there's freedom, right? There's the opportunity to get out of it, which is not something that is common in history. And again, this is not God advocating to say, well, let's go back to this, right? Let's go get some people and let's, in the 7 years, we can let them go free after that 7 years. That's not what we're talking about here either, to be clear. It's just trying to point out that there's brokenness and God is trying to speak into that brokenness, just as he does in all things. You talk about so much brokenness in this world. We don't know what perfection looks like anymore. We don't know what, we say heaven on earth, right? Where can we find that? Because there really isn't perfection anywhere on earth. And so God still speaks into it, he still works into it, and he still gives us laws and things to operate in a broken world, but it still is a broken world, even with the most perfect laws available to us. Yeah. All right, so how does someone become a slave? So, a couple of things that go into this. Extreme poverty. That's where one person might end up into slavery because they're basically selling themselves to get out of poverty, right? So that's one of the ways that people would become a Hebrew slave, right? So if you were a Hebrew and you were struggling, you were poor, there was no way for you, you would basically sell yourself to try to get out of poverty. Okay? And we'll see this here in just a little bit. We haven't covered this yet in the section. But there's also the thing here of potentially a dowry. So, like a father might sell his daughter as a servant because she'll eventually marry into that family. Okay? So, in other words, like if I had a daughter and there was a really good family that I wanted to make sure we connected with, I could sell my daughter into that family in the hopes that she would marry into that family, which then would get her into a much better social status than my own. Okay? So it wasn't even just like slavery to work, it was also trying to elevate your position, elevate your socioeconomic status. Okay? Another way that people became a Hebrew slave was through bankruptcy. Right? You owed debts, couldn't pay them anymore, so you had to work them off. Or if you were caught stealing and you had nothing to repay it with. Okay? So a couple of different ways to look at slavery, which again, you talk about servant, slave, all those different terms. It's kind of its own thing. It's different. And God's trying to provide parameters around it. So then as we talk about slavery in the Old Testament, especially when it comes to God's people, we have to understand a couple of key things. One, it was mutually arranged or typically chosen, right? So you talk about somebody who sells themselves because they're in debt, that's a choice, right? I am making that choice to sell myself. Or if I'm in a situation where I stole and couldn't repay, there was a mutually agreed upon thing, right? So it wasn't just grabbing somebody, taking them, and putting them into service, right? It was very much an act of will or at least a movement behind it from different parties. It also had a time limit, and as we'll see throughout chapter 21, it was highly regulated. It wasn't just something, well, you grab somebody and you could do whatever you want with them, okay? So slavery was typically chosen, like a choice the person would make, or is mutually arranged. You think about the father selling his daughter to another family. It had a time limit, and it was highly regulated. Any questions about that at all? Again, just to be clear, just because these three things exist does not mean God's like slavery is cool, right? Like slavery is okay. I want to make sure we're clear on that. This is just how God operated with his people as they operated in a broken world. All right, so then we go into verse 3. It says, if he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. Okay? So single here literally means with his body. Okay? So basically, what he comes in with, he goes out with. No more, no less. Okay? That's what it means. And if he ended up married in the process with kids, then they would all need to stay behind the kids and however long they were there until they could either be released, the 7 years, or redeemed, which was a way to speed up that 7 years. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so then we get this odd situation in verses 5 and 6, where it says, "But if the slave plainly says, 'I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free,' then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever." Okay? So, if someone was a slave and their 7th year came up and they were set to go free, they could say, "I want to stay. Right? I really love my master. He treats me well. This is a good gig. I get 3 hots and a cot, right? Like, we're good. This is a good place to be, right?" And so that was a choice, again, that the person could make. Not the master, but the person themselves. And if you notice in that, it had to include public consent and decree. So when it talks about taking him to God, to the door or the doorpost, that was something where basically he went before the people and said, as a servant, as a slave, "I want to stay with my master. This is my choice. I'm doing this on my own," right? And so that way that the public could see that this wasn't influence, this wasn't the master's manipulating or things of that nature, right? This was his choice. I made the choice to stay. And then on part of that, or on top of that, they basically gave him an earring, which is the awl through the ear, right? So that's what that is. And so when people would see that, they would know that that person is choosing to stay with their master. So if it was 10 years later and they saw John, who was still there working for this guy, and they had the awl in their ear, then they go, "Okay, John made that choice. There's nothing bad happening here. This is his choice to stay." In this way, it kind of becomes a system of checks and balances for the person who wanted to maintain and wanted to stay where they were. Oh, interesting. Interesting. Nate said that the NIV says judges and not God. See, that's interesting. I wonder what the Hebrew is originally in that, because that's a big translation discrepancy. Uh, Tell me more about that, Ross, when you say is it publicly noted? Sure. When you talk about what the role is, they're essentially speaking for God in that role. But to me, there's just such a big translation issue there where there's a distinct word for God and there's a distinct word for judges. So I'm curious in the Hebrew what the Hebrew is there. See, they use, in verse 6 in the Hebrew, they use El Elohim, which is God. So I'm wondering then if the judges is a reading into that, essentially of saying like this is the role they play, so therefore we're just going to call it judges to give it that. But the actual literal translation is bringing him to God, which yes would be judges in those instances. But it's just a fascinating note that there's such that there's a translation discrepancy in that. Not that there's an issue with that, just more. It's fascinating. Yeah, Rich. King James also says judges, huh? Yeah, that's crazy. That's interesting. Yeah, which would be the place where the judges would be and all those things. Yeah, but it's a fascinating thing that that's the interpretive move that's made in those Bibles. It's not wrong by any stretch of the imagination to say judges in that. It's just a it's just a move going from Elohim to judges on that. But yeah, it's not wrong. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a curious thing. Well, I think we should just throw this whole thing out then. I don't know what to believe anymore, Nate. I don't know what to believe anymore. No, it's good. Right, right. Well, and I think what it speaks to in that, Nate was saying that there's a difference between the judgment of God and the judgment of a human being. And I think what it speaks to is the judge's roles is very much the same as the judge of as God's judgment. Excuse me, I can't speak today. But I think that's what the articulation is in there, which is why that translation is so significant. You're going from God to judges, which just tells you the role and the severity of the role that these judges played in those moments in that culture. Yeah, it's fascinating because, yeah, when you look at 22, 8 through 9, you're talking about, if the thief is not found and how to handle like thievery and breaching of trust, right? So it's fascinating because, yeah, then what is there? The case of both parties shall come before judges or God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to his neighbor, or in that instance, judge. And that would be interesting here too. Hang on a second. Let me just see if that 22. Yeah, and in there too, in those verses. Hang on. Yeah, in those verses, Elohim is used as well for that. So, yeah, fascinating stuff. But it articulates the point that these rules, in their enforcement, it's as if God himself is enforcing the rules, right? Which is um, a very powerful statement about how they get lived out. Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah, Russ. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. Oh yeah, I mean that's where the judges are established, very much so. But what's interesting in that is that they're not um, they're not commissioned. Like they don't have the God title associated with it. That's what makes it just interesting to me, Ross. Overall, is that God is the literal word in the Hebrew, and we're translating it as judges. But again, that's where you look at it and you go, okay, so these guys are the ones who are uh, their judgments, their rulings are on par with what God is doing, which you would hope for any justice system, right? When you think about a justice system in particular, whatever it might be, whether it's Exodus 21 or 2024, that the laws are executed in a way that would be in alignment with God and what his ruling would be, if that makes sense. Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's cool. Those little things. I love that. Yep, Nate, I think we just need to toss the whole thing out and start over. What do you think? Just don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, yeah. No, you're spot on that, Nate. Nate was saying that when we get into Judges, it really strengthens that concept that they are speaking for God and on behalf of God in their roles. And yeah, that's 100% true. Yeah, I mean that's why you get your own book in the Bible, right? Like that's. But no, it's just a fascinating connection there. It's great. Any other thoughts? Anything else we can translate live that we need to look at the Hebrew for? Anybody? I'm glad it was Elohim because I don't know that I could translate the rest. Like I know that one, like in Hebrew. That's where I've got that one down. I got an A in Greek and I got like a C in Hebrew. So my Greek is really good. My Hebrew not so much. But that's because in Greek you hear like English words in the Greek words because Latin and there's the connection to all this stuff, right? So you can at least educationally guess what that word is based on what it sounds like in English. Um, Hebrew, you're out of luck. You're on your own. There's nothing there. All right. Oh, sorry. Did somebody say something else? Okay, sorry. Let's keep going then into verse 7. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her material rights. And if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. Okay? So now, as we talk about the term slave here, we're not talking about, someone who is working per se, but we're talking more of like a dowry piece, right? So a marriage kind of component, and how do you function in that? Okay? So this is a potential bride to be. So again, as we talk about this term slave, it can mean very broad things. Previously, it was the work aspect of it. Now we're getting into some more of the dowry elements to it. Okay? And what we see there is that there's just protections. Um, Say what you will about the system itself, like the fact that you had to buy her and all those things, but there's protections here, right? In verse 8, if she does not please her master, in other words, if he doesn't want her, basically says, nah, I'm good, right? Then he shall let her be redeemed. In other words, dad can buy her back, right? That's the concept, okay? He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people. So in other words, dad can buy her back, but he can't sell her off to anybody else, right? So her family has to want her back, bring her back, if that makes sense. And then in verse 9, if he designates her for a son, treat her as a daughter, right? So he can't treat her any less. While the son grows up and she grows up, there's protections in that. If he takes another wife for himself, if he meets her at a bar one sunny night, right, or whatever that might be, he can't diminish her food or clothing or material or marital rights. So in other words, this girl, this woman, whoever it might be, that is part of the dowry, the marriage thought process. She is entitled to everything that goes along with that. And if you find someone else along the way, you can't take anything away from her. You have to do all of the things for her and all of the things for the one that you brought home that night, whatever it might be. And then if he doesn't do those three things for her, she goes out for nothing. He gets nothing for her, right? And so again, it's we look at the system and we go, this is not ideal, right? Like this is not great. But at the same time, God does provide protections, and that's what you're going to see throughout this. Again, it's not an affirmation of the practice that they're doing, but rather it's trying to put provisions into the practice so that people are taken care of and they're treated well versus how we often tend to treat people as people. Does that make sense? Yeah, go ahead, Ross. No, you're okay. In the Old Testament? Mm-hmm. Well, so Ross's question is, the marriage piece here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ross. So I'm just making sure I'm repeating your question. That the marriage, as it's described here in Exodus 21, is not necessarily consensual. That it does feel like more like a slavery element, correct? Like that's what you're saying. And you're not wrong in that. Like I don't think you're wrong in seeing it that way. I mean, you talk about the dowry element, still very common practice in and even Eastern countries, right? You think of India, there's still dowries that are paid for things, or for people, I should say. Africa is still very common, so there's some cultural ties to it. In the United States, we're influenced by our liberties, our freedoms. And I'm not saying that's a bad influence. I'm just saying that's our scope by which we view things like marriage. And so we look for things, rightfully so, like consent, right? That matters in our culture, in our world, based off of different things that have progressed throughout history. Others just aren't in that same value spot. Um, and so, no, it very much is not a modern way of doing marriage. It was a very common way of doing marriage. Like if there was a group doing it the way we did back in Exodus, people would look at us strange, right? Like they would just look at us funny, like, what does that have to do with anything, right? But it's not a great practice, but it was the way that it was. Is it a sinful practice? I guess where I would go into that is the attitude behind it, right? So if you view your daughter, your wife, that person as property, then there's an issue, right? Something to be bargained with for gain or profit on your own, versus someone who is created in the image of God and loved by Him, right? So you think about that nowadays, and I think that's the difference, right? We don't see our children as property, right? They are our children, right? But we wouldn't necessarily put a value on them in the sense of, well, you could have my son for 5 cows and 2 fish, right? Like we wouldn't do that. But we do have ownership of them, and we take care of them to make sure that they grow up healthy and in good, strong ways. That's important, right? So there's a difference there, and it comes into the attitude. We talked about that with like the 10 Commandments, not this specific like example, but when you talk about the 10 Commandments, it really comes down to heart issues, right? Like where are you at in that? And if you're looking at the 10 Commandments and your attitude is reflecting that of the 10 Commandments in what you do, then everything else will fall in line, if that makes sense. Versus if your heart is very much greed based, how much can I get, those kinds of things, coveting, right? Those elements, your actions therefore are going to follow that too, right? Yeah, Narita. Yeah. Yeah, so Narita basically is talking about in New Guinea, and correct me if I say anything wrong here, Narita, because I want to make sure I get this right. The groom's family would compensate the bride's family because essentially the bride's family is losing a worker, right? And so that's where the compensation would come in, because the women of the clan would do a lot of work. They do a lot of gardening, a lot of care, a lot of those elements of things. And so the groom's family was just simply compensating the groom or the bride's family for that loss of wages or loss of workforce, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's a great perspective. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. In Jesus' day, did they have more than one wife? Yeah, 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 they did for sure. I don't know that it was in the common per se, like in the lower class of people or even in the middle class. But you talk about the kings and rulers and things they would absolutely have, and it may not be known as a wife, but they had harems, right, and multiple groups of women as part of that. Yeah, great question. So when did that change? Boy, I think there's a lot of evidence for the evolution of that throughout history, right? I think it's more so when you saw the church's influence in society in terms of what it actually looks like. Like, just as the example, Gentiles, right, in the New Testament, often would be seen as very wild in their practice, specifically when it comes to sexual things, right? And so all of a sudden Christianity comes into the Gentiles and some of those things diminish. Not all of it. It's never going to be completely gone on this side of eternity, but you start to see some of those movements where Christianity influences those thoughts about sexuality, influences those thoughts about how do we practice monogamy versus polygamy, right? And so you just start to see some of those influences, and especially where the church had a strong influence after, like post-Christianity or post-New Testament. I'm thinking of more like the Middle Ages kind of concept, but there was still, what was it, King Henry, I think is who it was, who had how many wives? 8 wives? 7, something like that. Yeah, it's how we get the Anglican Church, is because he wanted the Pope to approve his 8th divorce, 7th divorce, or whatever it is. Pope wouldn't do it, so he said, fine, I'll make my own church who will approve it, and so he did. That's how we get the Anglican Church. Obviously, that's not what the Anglican Church still stands for, but it's how we get it. So I think there's evidence throughout history. To say like when it was specifically is hard to say, but I would say that when Christianity became more of an influence globally is where you started to see that move into more of a monogamous view. Yeah. And I think you see that the reverse trend of that when places become less Christian, right? So as you talk about the walking away of faith, now all of a sudden you start talking about polygamy again. You start talking about all these things. It's a big part of our country, frankly. And I'm not saying the United States should be a Christian nation or anything like that. I'm just saying you could see the walking away from faith. And I think what you see in that is then you start seeing things like thruples is what they're called, where it's not a couple anymore, it's thruples, because you have 3 people who are operating together, right, in that way. Polygamy is big. Again, there's a lot of sexual things that come with groups of people nowadays, right? And I think it's just reflective of the other side of that, where when there's a lack of Christianity values, those kinds of things, then you start to see the decline of monogamy, or even question, why do we need it at all, right? Yeah. So inverse telling that too. Yeah, Nate. Yeah. Yeah, Paul talks about that, as Nate was saying in 1 Corinthians 7, you said, correct? Yeah, where if you're going to be married, you're going to be married to one. He prefers not to be married, or would rather not be married, just because of the ministry he's undertaking. And I know that's where the Catholic Church gets its view that priests should not be married, from that phrasing from Paul, but it's not the point of his statement in that pastors should not be married. I'd hate to have to tell Katie that, and that would be kind of a bummer. Kind of a bummer. So the question is, wasn't there an initial point in the Catholic Church where the priests could marry, and then they moved away because of the monetary responsibility? I'm not sure, Bernie, that might be true. I don't know enough about it to speak intelligently to it, but it wouldn't be surprising. But from what I understood, it always came from that 1 Corinthians 7 passage, Paul's encouragement to, at least what they believe is Paul's encouragement to not be married. Yeah, yeah. But I'm sure there's a lot of practical things that came into that for them. Good questions. Any other questions? Yeah, Nick, go ahead. And then Lenny. Hmm. Oh, interesting. Interesting. So Nate was saying it was your great grandpa or your grandpa? Your grandpa. Nate's grandpa, when Yeah. Yeah. When he got married, Nate's grandpa, the bride wore black because he was married to the church first. Yeah. And then to her. Yeah, I don't think that would work for Katie. I don't know that. I don't think I would want to propose that to Katie from, yeah. I mean, she understands like the pastoring and congregational thing. Just the wearing of black piece, I'm not sure she would be okay with. Yeah. Yeah. Times do change. Yep. Yep. Lenny, what was your question or comment? Yep. Yeah. So the question is like, who were the judges, right? Like, essentially as people. And when you look at Exodus 18, it starts in verse 21. It says, "Moreover, look for able men." So in other words, people who are healthy. Okay, from all the people, men who fear God. In other words, they were constantly seeking God and His will, right? So that would be, in our case today, studying scriptures, those kinds of things, right? So for them, it was the constant pursuit of God's truth, okay? Who are trustworthy, hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens, right? So in other words, they have an impeccable record. They're trustworthy. They're full of integrity, those kinds of things. And so how they would make those decisions is based off of what was already known of God and what He had for them. Yep. Yeah, correct. So essentially, it's very much an early view of like our judicial system. I mean, the fact that you would want people who are able, who are trustworthy, who do fear God. I mean, that would be a great thing, who are genuinely seeking out God's will in what they do, to make the rulings that they rule over. Our judges more so seek out like the truth of law as it's been written down in various laws and forms of law and things of that nature. So I think there's obviously the big difference there, but um, yeah, very much the same kind of concept. Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, yep. Our judges are known as honorable. Yep, Your Honor. Yep, yep. The Honorable Judge Joseph Wapna. Yep, that's right. Wapna. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Go ahead, Bernie. Sure. Yep, yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So about 11th, 12th century is where that change started to happen for priests being able to marry or not marry. Yeah. And technically, you still have married priests. If they were married before they entered into seminary, there's no call for divorce in that. They bring their families with them into that. It's just a very rare occasion. Yep. No, thanks for looking that up. It's great. I will tell you, I did have to marry Katie. I did have to pay a dowry. Um, that was um, that was something that was fun. Katie's dad always joked about that. So I had to get cows. I had to find cows. And I can't remember the number of cows. So when I went to go ask Katie's dad, Terry, for permission, I stopped at the Toys R Us off of 494. That's no longer there. And I got a farm set. Like I bought one of those farm sets, right? Like in the box, and I brought it over to his house, and just asked if it would be okay if I asked Katie to marry me, and showed him that I have a dowry for him. So we laid it out on the table. He said, "Well, let's take a look at what you got here." So we laid it out, and there was a barn, and there was like like a plastic grass field kind of concept, and a couple pieces of fence, some pigs, some chickens, No cows. No cows. He said, well, you got some land here, so we'll take that. That's fine, is what he said. So he was a good sport about it. But a few years later, I found one with cows, and I gave it to him just to make sure I paid up. I paid up the way that it was, required. So we're all good and legal now. Yeah, but it was fun. It was fun. All right. Where are we? Sorry. The protections provided is where we were, talking about all those elements. So again, talking about this, it's not selling a daughter for work per se, as it is more of a marital agreement, contract, whatever you might want to call it, and just putting some stipulations around that, some protections. Any questions about that at all? All right, so then we get into more of this, right? So whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar, that he may die. Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. When men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes to his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with a staff, he who struck him shall be clear, only he shall pay for the loss of his time, and shall have him thoroughly healed. When a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. And then there's a lot more that goes into that. We'll stop there for a second, because there's enough there to talk about for a little bit. So, there is a distinction here in verse 12. We talk about intent, wanting to strike a man to kill him, right? That's a death penalty. Okay? Intent. But the verse 13, it's different. If a man did not lie in wait for him, if there's no intention of killing the guy and it still ends up happening, then there's a different way to handle that. Okay? And he can go to a lot of different places to basically await trial. That's the gist. So when it talks about man willfully attacks, verse 13, if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. Right? The point of fleeing was not to get away from consequences, it was to go to a place to be protected until a trial could happen, which wasn't necessarily always the fastest in the world. Okay? So it was a place for him to go so that no one would try to avenge whoever he accidentally killed. So there is a difference. Striking a man with intent to kill him, it's the death penalty. Those who struck or maybe did not intend to kill anybody, but it ended up happening, there's a place to go until they can stand trial. And there's an interesting note here. I think I'm just going to read the note because it's fascinating all the way around. I don't want to miss any of it. So it's question 11, the safe to stand trial piece. Sanctuary cities were appointed after they entered into the promised land, right? So in other words, this is what kind of happened afterwards. Places people facing manslaughter could flee to for protection until their case was heard. And there's 6 of them. So it's Kadesh, Shechem, Kirjath Arba, Bezer, Ramoth, and Golan. Okay? So those are the places they could flee to. There's 6 of them. And then once found innocent of intent, the manslayer would stay in the city of refuge and not return home until the death of the present high priest. If the manslayer went outside of the city before the death of the high priest and was killed by the avenger of blood, which is somebody taking revenge, essentially, the avenger would be in his right to do so without facing charges because the manslayer left the protection that was given to him. However, after the death of the high priest, the manslayer could return home with no fear of retribution. In the case that the manslayer was found guilty of intent, the murderer would face the consequences of his actions immediately according to the law. So there you go. That's the rule. Them's the rules. Okay? That's how that all plays out. It's fascinating, isn't it? Just kind of how that all plays into the sanctuary cities and how that plays into what does that mean then for accidentally killing somebody. Any questions about that at all? Okay. So then in verse 14, we see the taking away from the altar, right? And what does that mean? Basically, it just means that God himself would not spare them from the death penalty, right? So if they killed somebody intentionally, the punishment was death. And taking away from the altar meant that God himself agrees with that, essentially. Okay. And even with the concept that even God's altar, even though there is forgiveness there, it would not save him from spirit or from physical consequences, which in this case is the death penalty. Okay. So now you get some application, right? You talk about do not murder, the fifth commandment. Now we're getting some of the application into that. Okay. And then it continues on about striking father or mother, steals a man, sells him, all those things. Whoever curses his father or mother shall be put to death. So at least in verses 15 and 17, we get some more. The fourth commandment explained, right? Don't kill your parents. Don't curse them. Now, I don't know, is curse the word you guys have too in your Bibles for the NIV? Okay. I was just curious. I just want to make sure I understood. Okay. Wasn't sure if they used another word there for that. Dishonors. Okay. Yeah, and that's probably the best way to describe what does it mean to curse your parents. It's not just cussing them out, right? But it's bringing dishonor to them in different ways by not taking care of them, right? Abandoning them, those kinds of elements. Now we've talked about the I want to make sure I'm clear on that. We've talked about some of the situations where what happens when your parent isn't worthy of honor in your eyes. Like we've talked about those elements. This is just speaking to the broad piece of it. It's not speaking to those elements of if you've had to move away from your parents because of dysfunctional or toxic situations. That's not what this is referring to. This is just speaking generally. Okay. And you wonder how, I think this is more the evening class because we have somebody who has a Jewish neighbor, and so they've talked about some of these laws with the Jewish neighbor, and there's like 613 laws that they have on top of this and all that jazz. And as we've talked about the 10 Commandments, and even here, you see how quickly you can get to 613, right? It doesn't take long to really start parsing these ones out to make sure it's understood entirely. Which then also goes into the concept of Jesus living these out perfectly. Blows my mind, right? You think of all these little things, all the little things that come from the details of these commandments, and he was able to do it perfectly. And then in verse 16, we get this concept of stealing a man, selling him. Anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. There's image of God issues here, right? How do you see somebody when you steal him and sell him? You don't see him as nothing more than something like a commodity of some kind. In the same way, you talk about sex trafficking, you talk about slavery in the centuries, the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, 19th century, right? What is that? They stole them and then they sold them, right? So the churches that previously said slavery is a good thing because the Bible commands it just conveniently forgot to mention that part of it. It's kind of a big deal. But again, as we see through this section, there's a lot of protections here, right? It's not something that favors the master per se, or even the person who's purchasing, for lack of a better way of saying it. There's a lot of protections for the person on the other side of the coin. Yeah, go ahead, Russ. Yeah. Harry a bunch of Ishmaelites. Yeah. It rings a bell. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I saw that too, Ross, that's what I first thought of. Who basically steals a man, sells him, and anyone found in his possession of him. I mean, that's essentially what the Ishmaelites did. They didn't steal him. I mean, they paid a price for him, but at the same time, technically he's stolen property, right? His brothers put him in a cistern, left him to die, right? Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. I had the same thought, Ross, that in that kind of a Joseph kind of concept there. And they left. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep. They lived. Yep. Doesn't mean it's always right. Yep. Yep. Doesn't mean it's always right. So then we get this fighting concept. I want to make sure because we got like 5 minutes left. I want to make sure um, we get to this one here. Um, Verses 18 and 19. It says, when men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes to his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear, only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall have him thoroughly healed. Right? So what happens if somebody attacks another person, hits them, and they end up in the medical hospital, for lack of a better way of saying it? How are you supposed to work through that? If he survives, great, you're kind of off the hook, but you got to make sure you pay for his care, okay? And what I love about that, and what for me this enriched, is the story of the Good Samaritan, because it wasn't necessarily that he hit the guy, right? This was after he had been mugged, and somebody else hit him. And what does he do? He picks him up, brings him to the place so that he can get healed, and then he pays for that recovery and even more, right? And so to me, when I look at this, you talk about two guys who are fighting here and they do this, and this is how they are to behave, right? The Good Samaritan wasn't even involved in the fight. He had nothing to do with it, and yet fulfilled what this piece is. In that way, it just to me makes a stronger connection that the Good Samaritan is Jesus, who isn't striking us, who isn't the one hitting us with a rock, but yet still sees us wounded from somebody else doing that, mainly our sin, our sinful nature, and pays the price to care for us, even above and beyond what is needed to heal. Okay? Just a powerful New Testament connection for me as I was looking through that. Yeah. But don't hit people with stones. Just the best way to avoid that one altogether. Just telling you. Any other thoughts? We'll kind of end up there today, if that makes sense. We'll end with Jesus. I think that's always a good place to end. How about that? Good? So VBS is next week, so we will not be meeting next week. I know we've kind of been off and on here for a couple weeks. We'll steady out here after VBS, I promise, until vacation time. No, I'm just kidding. But we'll steady out here after VBS next week. But if you get a chance, pray for Vacation Bible School next week. It's going to be awesome. Just pray that kids and families and volunteers, just that we'd be a blessing to them. So we'll continue in the whole of laws about slaves when we get back together again. Let's close in prayer. Lord God, Heavenly Father, we thank you that you sent Jesus into this world to care for us, even though he's not the one who damaged us. Lord, we thank you for the price paid through him and his life and his death. And Lord, we pray that as we continue in our lives and in our world, that we would do the same for others, to help them, to support them, to treat them as you see them and as you do in your life with them. And we pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.